Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for coming to our webinar tonight. My name is Dakota Moore. I'm with the Kentucky Horticulture Council. This webinar is put on with the Kentucky Horticulture Council, the Organic Association of Kentucky, and the UK Center for Crop Diversification. I just want to advertise another webinar we've got coming up on April 4th. I will drop the link in the chat. And this one is going to be on soil health. It'll be from Dr. Sean Lucas. He's with Kentucky State University. And this will be on a Tuesday, the same time as this webinar. And before Jackson, our guest tonight, start presenting, Brooke from Oak is going to tell us about some upcoming field days they've got.
Yeah, hey everyone. Just wanted to let you know we have a couple field days that are also part of this work we're doing in partnership with the Center for Crop Diversification and the Horticultural Council. So the first one is coming up on April 13th. It's in Crestwood, Kentucky at Pavel's Garden. So growing undercover on a market vegetable farm. So that is filling up. If y'all are interested in checking it out, I'll drop the link in the chat. You can go ahead and register. We're really excited about that one. And then coming up in May, we have an event at Fall Family Riverside Farm on May 9th. And that'll really look at pastured livestock and soil health practices, rotational grazing. They have broilers, chickens, turkeys, heritage pig, pastured pigs, and pastured sheep and cows as well. So hope you can join us.
Thanks, Brooke. And I'll get a link to that event page on the Oak website put in the chat as soon as Jackson starts speaking. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackson Rolett. He is he's a co-founder of the No-Till Growers. They are a family of podcasts focused on farming profitably while reducing tillage. They've got podcasts on no-till market gardens, a composter podcast, a collaborative farming podcast, and several more. And Jackson is a farmer in Kentucky. His farm is Stonehouse Market Farm. So I will turn that over to him now. Thanks, Jackson.
Hey, thank you all. I don't recognize any names in the little list here. So to everyone that I have not met, welcome. I'm going to try to get through this presentation as quickly as possible. It is quite long, and I'm going to try to squeeze it in. That way, if anybody has any questions afterward. I'm also going to pull up the chat so that while I'm giving my presentation, if you have a question and I see that it's something that I can address right then, I'll try and answer questions as I go, and I'll try and leave some time at the end for questions about things that people have. I'm also going to gloss over some of this stuff since I think most of us have at least a little bit of experience in growing, and try and give everyone a basic understanding of what it is No-Till Growers is about, the things that we're teaching about and talking about, and as well as pointing you to more resources or some of my favorite resources for further reading. Because, I think some of the work that Sarah's doing or the NRCS or some books that have been published are also great follow-up resources, along with our podcast and all that good stuff. The last thing I want to say is if you can make it to Pavel's Garden, that Oak Field Day, I think Brooke said that tickets are selling out. That's one of my favorite gardens in Kentucky, so you should absolutely try to get to that. But anyway, we're going to move on. So this right here is my presentation for the practical implications of, what did I title this one? Ecological market gardening. Let me get some of my other windows out of the way. So qualifications. So who am I and where did I come from? I've had about 10 years of experience growing in Kentucky, from 5 to 10 acres of plasticulture. And when we stopped farming at Stonehouse Market Farm, and I'll tell you why we stopped farming in a little while, we were at about a ½ acre of no-till organic production. We were on that ½ acre doing a year-round multi-farm CSA and farmers markets, making a full-time living. I've been through several of the Market Garden online course classes. I have varying opinions about those, but I have been fortunate enough to look at those and kind of get a diverse perspective on the market garden world. I have completed Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web course to get an understanding about the microbiology that we keep saying that we want to foster in our soil. And then we've produced 200 hours worth of podcasts and interviews. So I've edited most of those and listened to all of those, and so I think that comes with a good kind of general understanding of where market gardening is right now. But enough about me. Let's get on. I was surprised when I really started digging into terms like no-till or ecological market gardening, how little I understood about photosynthesis, which is kind of the basis of what we do as farmers. Is we're fostering photosynthesis. And you can see on the right there, the title above this picture that Hannah Crabtree so lovingly illustrated is the Living Soil Handbook. So that's a book that my partner in no-till growers, Jesse Frost, put out. If you don't have a copy of that, you can request one from the library, or you can buy a copy through no-tillgrowers.com. That's really the foundation of all the work that we do. But what we wanted to provide in that book, and right here, is like a cursory understanding of really what photosynthesis is. And there's a really important part I want to get to here. So we know that plants transport water from their roots to the chloroplast, in which they use sunlight to split that water molecule apart. One of the things that they do with that is create carbohydrates, of which the plant is made, and the root structure that sort of provides a scaffold for the plant. But what we are learning really, at least I learned very recently, and what more of us are coming to understand, is that most of those carbohydrates are actually sent down to the root zone in the form of exudates, where they're mixed with hormones and other acids, and they end up below ground, not just as the plant roots, but really they're there to interact with the soil food web in the community that's below ground. One of the ways that we talk about it is, think of these exudates as little sugar snacks that they use to barter with. And what do they do that bartering with but the living soil and the soil food web? So this, again, is another photo from the book. It sort of provides a basic understanding of the food web below ground. So in a nutshell, bacteria and fungi extract nutrients from soil organic matter. This is another thing that I learned not too long ago. I thought that the plants maybe just sucked it up from the soil organic matter, but really it's the bacteria and fungi that make those plant available, the nutrients and the micronutrients in soil organic matter. And then there is a scaffolding of a food web on top of that. So the bacteria and fungi are consumed. That waste product is then also plant available, and then those microarthropods and protozoa and nematodes are consumed by predatory arthropods, predatory nematodes, and the chain goes on. And the waste products of all of that consumption and all of that death and decay are what make a lot of those soil organic matter nutrients available to plants. So the diversity below ground is essentially what keeps things like disease-causing organisms in check. One of the things that we'll get to is intensive tillage. Not only releases carbon and prevents carbon sequestration, but also it destroys the biological nutrient cycle. Because what happens after you till is the first populations to recover are going to be disease-causing organisms. So whenever you can reduce tillage from a system, you're allowing the soil food web to develop some of the disease suppressive organisms that are in that soil as well. But we'll get into how to do that. So what's the ideal? So really, we based all of our work on the 4 ecological growing principles thought up by the NRCS. We didn't make any of these up ourselves. We stole these from the NRCS and based our work off of them. How do we apply these principles? Disturb the soil as little as possible, keep it planted, keep it covered, and grow as much diversity as possible. How do we take all of these that we maybe understand on a large staple crop scale and apply them to our small market gardens, which, several years ago, my market garden was extremely tillage heavy. And I could see negative effects because of that. One of the other things that we like to put as number 5 in there is we don't have a dogmatic approach about this. We do believe that there's a place for some tillage events, given we use them as a tool to move forward and not rely on them and just constantly have to deal with the negative side effects. So we're going to get into what I call no-till, what we call no-till, but really when we say no-till, we just mean all of those other principles combined. No-till has just been kind of a catchword that we have gotten into a habit of saying. But we're going to go over, initial field setup considerations, scale and tools, thinking about previous crops, transition to next crops, compost amendments, mulches and cover crops, and then, the time versus labor dynamic. So breaking ground. Yes, it is ironic. I'm with no-till growers, and here is my buddy on a giant tractor breaking up our sod that we had. So you're going to want to do an initial site assessment. What is your soil type? And a lot of us in Kentucky have clay soil. There is an approach that some people use in the space called a never-till approach, where they don't even till the ground the first time. That's not something that we particularly recommend with clay soils. So for us here in Kentucky, generally, the way that I and several of us would approach farming in Kentucky like this is to do an initial tillage. We can also incorporate cover crops into that. We can incorporate amendments into that, compost into that, but we do recommend an initial tillage. Some of the other things that you're going to want to consider are the slope, the compaction layer. So you're going to want to address that as you're setting up a no-till garden, whether that's with a subsoil or something like that. And this is also a place where I do recommend tractor work to set up a garden if your space allows for it, so that you can get to those subcompaction layers in a much faster manner. But then also, what is the present cover and what has been the past use? And really what that boils down to is, are you going to be dealing with annual versus perennial weeds? You're really going to want to know those perennial weeds because they are much tougher to deal with in a no-till system after you get it established. Your scale of production is another consideration. And then what is your timeline? So how much time do you have to go from entering into your ground to being at market? You want to allow as much time as necessary to set yourself up for success. But given what timeline you're working with is going to determine your approach into ecological growing. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do recommend, if not everybody has gotten a hold of this book or read it, The Lean Farm. And the reason why I mention it here is when you go into some of these ecological approaches, what you're going to be leaning a lot more heavily on is labor. So, you're going to be doing, making a lot of steps around your farm. You're going to be moving a lot of materials around. So you're going to want to make that part of your operation as efficient as possible. So I really recommend the Lean Farm for how to make your operation function above ground, more effectively. And that's some of the stuff that they talk about in that book. But we're pressed for time. I'm not going to spend too much time on that here. So let's talk about tillage versus no tillage. That's sort of the first, disturb the soil as little as possible. When we think of tillage, we see all of these things on the left. And we do know that repeated intensive tillage is detrimental to soil health. We went over that. It's easy and straightforward to incorporate amendments and cover crops and residues. It does rely on continuous mechanical power, and it is very dependent, especially here in Kentucky, on weather and soil conditions because we have that clay soil. It can really be impacted if you do a tillage event and it's too wet. When we think of no-till techniques, it is a lot slower and higher initial labor and even material requirements, though those may decrease over time. We do know that, again, given you do it well, it's better for soil health over time. Requires more complex and thoughtful approach. So you have to develop a system. You have to know where you're going to be a year from now when you start this process of ecological market gardening. And it's difficult to incorporate amendments or residues. I'm not going to quite say difficult, but we have to do a little bit of unlearning about what we mean by residues, and learn some new systems and approaches for what we've previously been exposed to. And then it's less dependent on weather and soil conditions because you're not, using a lot of heavy tillage events. And these are not mutually exclusive on a farm. There are certain aspects of a farm that may be more conducive to no-till, and some that will require tillage, and that's okay. What we're aiming for is trying to reduce it and remove it where we can, and then work on incremental improvement over time. Not going to get into this too much either. I'm going to point you towards a resource, but when we look at a task on the left, this is the stuff that we have to do to the soil to grow crops, and then the traditional tillage implements, but then here are no-till alternatives for virtually everything that you have to do to prepare soil. All of this can be found in this book right here. Highly recommend that one as well. This is probably my second favorite book on farming. It's sort of a case study at Fritz Farm, and that I think is one of the premier farms for this particular methodology on the East Coast. They're up in Maine, of course they are. But Daniel Mays does a wonderful, wonderful job. So, we think of ecological growing, you could do it at a larger scale. We've talked to growers that are doing no-till farming on hundreds of acres, using cover crops and roller crimpers, flail mowers for managing cover crops and whatnot. So it can be done on a large scale. What we're generally focused on is on a small scale. So people using BCSs, power harrows, or that's the PDR attachment to do shallow tillage when necessary. Compost spreaders, so sheet mulching with compost or other mulches. Flail mower, which I think is probably the most important tool or implement if you're using a BCS-based approach or a small tractor approach. And then we get into human scale, which I'm particularly fond of. So the use of silage tarps to eliminate weeds or prepare ground. Broad forks for aeration and subsoil compaction. The tilther, so you can see on the right there's the power harrow, and then on the left the tilther. Another tool that I'm fond of for really that surface layer of mixing in amendments and dealing with debris and residue. Bed rakes, and my favorite, the harvest cart for moving materials around. So why did we go from a tractor-based approach to a human scale approach? Number one, it fit my sort of ability and skill set. I wasn't particularly mechanically inclined, and if something broke on a tractor, I wasn't the one to fix it. It was space efficient, so we didn't have a lot of ground to work with on my last farm. We had about an acre of really prime growing space, and it fit that acre really, really well. It was more resilient to, and it is more resilient to, input and capital price increases. So we're not having to spend a lot on fuel. We're not having to fix a tractor. So, that's a plus. It's easier to utilize waste streams and input resources. So we're not dealing with a lot of chemical fertilizer inputs. We're able to capture waste streams like compost sources or mulch sources or inputs from around us, as opposed to having to get those, from places where we can't negotiate with the price. Creates more jobs per acre of production, easier to implement ecological practices and techniques with a greater diversity of crops. So, when you think of ecological growing and you think of large scale, a lot of people are doing that with staple crops. So, a lot of winter squash, pumpkins, sweet potatoes, things like that. We thought that it was easier to approach a more ecological farm and grow a wider diversity of crops if we focused on this 1 acre or less market garden setup. And it's more family friendly. So of all of the jobs that I had to do, 99% of them, the kids could be out there with me helping alongside. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dangerous. And, we really liked our kids being out in the field with us and not having to leave because the tractor was working or harvesting equipment or whatnot. So that's really just kind of a personal thing. So let's get into bed preparation and approaches. So once you have, say in Kentucky, initially tilled your spot, gotten soil tests and applied compost or amendments or what have you, what are some ways that you can go about creating a no-till or an ecological growing space? One way is tarping and occultation or solarization. So that's these big silage tarps that you use to increase heat and cut out light to try and germinate the weeds that are there, and terminate them. So it's more of a stale seed bedding approach. Some people do this with a flame weeder. You can do it with tarps. a very efficient way in terms of labor. You can set the tarp out for 2 weeks to a few months, depending on the season, to prepare your ground ahead of time, and then pull those off and do what you need to do to start growing. Another way to do it is, and I will say we relied heavily on the silage tarp approach. I really do appreciate it. There's lasagna or sheet mulching. This is a picture of Jared's Real Food in California. So they do layers of compost and brown material like straw or hay, and typically we'll grow a cover crop in that. And then after that cover crop is grown, they will terminate that cover crop and begin growing a cash crop. You could go right into a cash crop with it. I do hear that when people use this lasagna or sheet mulch approach, or maybe they do a cardboard sort of lasagna approach, growing a cover crop first really sets the process up for success down the line. Usually people's first crops tend to struggle a little bit, particularly with nitrogen, but then they have really good results after that first crop. So if you're going with this approach, you might want to give yourself time to sow a cover crop. The deep compost mulch method. So this picture is of Satin Hill Farm, somebody that we've worked with in the past at No-Till Growers. He's got a ton of videos online if you want to check out his farm. So he works on about a half to a quarter acre, and he does the cardboard and deep compost approach. And he can explain all of that in his videos. I'll leave a link to that as well. The deep compost mulch method is also something my partner Jesse Frost uses at Rough Draft Farmstead. Again, a ton of videos on YouTube about how he goes about that approach. You can do an initial tillage with mulching, be it with like a woven fabric mulch after you till an area. Form your beds if you feel you need to form beds, and you can use a synthetic mulch for growing. That way you can get into the ground sooner and not have to worry so much about the weed pressure. It also does double duty in that it'll terminate a lot of the weeds in that space while you're also able to get a cash crop out of it. There is also a tillage without mulch approach. If you're going to do this approach without a mulch, so if you don't have access to a straw that you're comfortable using, or mulching compost, or don't have the capital to invest in a woven fabric, then you're going to have to do it without mulch. And it's not impossible. I've done it before, but you're going to have a weed management strategy, and you're going to have to be prepared to cultivate. Just because you say, I'm done tilling, it doesn't mean your annual weeds or your perennial weeds go away. So that is, hopefully your weeds going into this space, and you're going to need to have a plan for managing them before you get to this point. There's also rotational tillage. So a lot of particularly farms that are operating at above an acre, maybe 3, 5, 10 acres, are finding ways to reduce the tillage on their farm, particularly with, and I'm going to talk about it in this next one, in situ mulches. So what you can see here is Evening Song Farm. We recently had an episode on our podcast about them, and they explained all of the nuts and bolts about rotational tillage. So they have effectively removed half of the tillage from their farm by knowing when, where, and with what crops they can grow cover crops beforehand, terminate those cover crops. You can see the black tarps there, and then go into particularly things like winter squash, sweet potatoes, and their fall brassicas, which they rely quite heavily on. So they have found a way to remove much of the tillage from their farm, have seen increased productivity, less labor, all of that good stuff. And then in situ mulches, which you can see here. So, these are for farms that are even operating at a small scale. This is Jesse at Rough Draft Farmstead growing an in situ mulch. So what they will do is, what you can do is grow a cover crop, and then you can replicate large scale mechanical equipment with something like a T-post. You see them there with a T-post and string on either side, stomping down, what looks like a rye crop. They will cover that with a tarp for several weeks to go ahead and make sure that it's terminated. And when they peel that tarp back, they have a mulch to plant into. So they have effectively grown a cover crop and grown their mulch in place without having to, what traditionally we would have taken a rototiller to and then waited to break down for 2 weeks before we planted. So that's a method that you have in the toolkit when you think about bed prep. How am I doing on time? Okay. Another thing to consider is bed size. So you're going to want to think about that when you start planning your no-till approach. Are you going to want to accommodate any tractor equipment at all? You know, a lot of people standardize their beds to 30 inches by 100 feet with 18-inch pathways. That's not for everyone. And just because that's what all the tools are designed for, it doesn't mean that that's how you have to do it. So what we have migrated to on our farm after trying it several different ways was a 36-inch bed, 48 feet long with 24-inch pathways. We felt like that gave us a lot more room to move around. We had a little room to spare. And it seemed easier for 2 people to take care of as opposed to having a team of 4 out there all the time. You know, one of the examples that I give is when you're dealing with 100-foot beds and you start dragging silage tarps around and you happen to be the only one in the field that day, a 100-foot silage tarp after a good rain seems to weigh about 10 tons and it's going to break you trying to pull that thing out of the field. But when we broke things down into smaller 50-foot sections, I was able to, or me and one other person were easily able to move materials around in that field like silage tarps, row cover, things like that. And then whether or not to raise your beds. This is something that I dealt with a lot when going into ecological market gardening because everybody used the rotary plow to raise their beds every year. What I found is that I didn't need to do that. Once I began to remove many of the tillage events from our operation, I found that one, the beds passively began to raise because of the mulching material that I would use, or because of the cover crops, or because of the compost I was adding. But also that was just something that we didn't need to do because I was never on a farm that had drainage issues. So really think about whether you want to put the time and energy and equipment and labor into raising beds before you do so, because it just might not be something that you have to contend with. I wasted a lot of time and energy and effort raising beds, and then when I stopped raising beds, I found that I didn't need to do them in the first place. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Somebody asked, will covering a tarp with a tarp kill the microorganisms in the soil? It depends on how long you leave that tarp on there for. A lot of people, a lot of research, or more and more research is being done on occultation and solarization and what it does to the microorganisms in the soil. If you leave it on there for an excessive amount of time, you're going to get more die-off of those microorganisms. So long as they have roots in the ground that they're able to feed on, essentially, that soil food web is going to remain mostly intact. A lot of those microorganisms will go dormant outside of their normal temperature range as well, so that when that tarp is pulled off, water is introduced to the system over a short amount of time, most of that soil food web will remain intact. If you leave a tarp on the soil for 6 months, 9 months, or if you leave a clear tarp for solarization on in the middle of the summer for 3 months, that's going to have a negative effect on your soil life, given what I've read and understand. If you're going to leave it on there for 3 weeks in the summer, 2 weeks in the summer, just to terminate a cover crop and take it off, you'll want to leave it on there for the least amount of time to do the job. That way, most of it remains intact. So let's move on. One of the things that you want to consider about bed prep is what was here before. So a lot of the questions that we get is, that's great, I've prepared my beds, I've planted a crop, but how do I go from one crop to the next crop? It's not particularly intuitive when we're so used to just tilling a bed every time we need to turn it over, what we say, flip it. So, you know, you have shallow rooted, delicate things like lettuce. Maybe you have big tap rooted things that will, you know, brassicas that will regrow if you just cut them off at the stalk. Or it's something like a root, like a carrot, where you actually pull up most of the plant from the bed. Or a cover crop. You know, this is Sudan grass, cowpeas, buckwheat, and sun hemp. You know, that's going to have a pretty vigorous root system to deal with. And then what's going into the ground next is your second consideration. So are you going to be seeding, or are you going to be transplanting? Are you using a paper pot? are you using a robust seeder like a jang or a very delicate seeder like a pinpoint? Is what you're going to be harvesting the roots, or is it going to be the greens, fruits, anything above the ground? So the question is, how intensive do you need to be? That was always a question I asked myself. How much do I need to do to this bed just to get it back into production? And of course, the answer is no more than necessary. You don't want to waste a lot of time. So, you know, if you're going into something with a really delicate cedar, you're going to need a fine seed bed. You're going to need to do whatever you need to do to get it to that state. But if you're transplanting something like brassicas or tomatoes, maybe you don't need to pull all of the root stumps out of the ground. You can leave those roots in place to continue breaking down and feeding that soil food web. I want to go over a couple examples because it can be a little confusing. So this is a bed flip routine that we developed on our farm. This is sort of an order of operations that we used. So we would do whatever we needed to do to terminate the previous crop, and that is just to keep it from growing. Maybe you can cut it off at the ground level and just leave it in place. Remove any weeds if necessary, fertilize and address any sort of compaction. So this is the point where we would spread any fertilizer we would need, spread any compost, do any broad forking if necessary. It wasn't necessary with all crops, and over time became less necessary. Create a seed bed. If we were going to be seeding something that was delicate, we would use a tilther, and then replant. And if we didn't have anything to replant or sow in the bed immediately, we would cover it with a tarp with the white side up to reduce the heat, or something just to keep it, you know, maybe we could terminate the weeds that way, or just kind of hold on to it. So yeah, this is a little more detail on how we would go about doing it in particular. And this is what it looked like. So that bed that you saw on the last slide, this is what it was before, was a bed of arugula. So that was the last harvest. So we would do the last harvest and then go through and mow it down. And then we would use a stirrup hoe lightly over the bed to chop everything off at about just below bed level, and then use a rake to rake everything out of that bed. So to get it mostly clean. Now, most of those roots are still intact in the ground. And then we broad forked, spread a small amount of compost and amendments over the bed. And that's what it looked like after we would use the tilther. And then we would plant lettuce into it. So that's one example of a bed flip in a high tunnel with delicate crops. And then another approach that we use, so this is head lettuce. And when we got a bed ready for head lettuce, you can see down on the lower left-hand corner of that picture, there's a blank spot. Well, that's where that lettuce came from. We would cut the head of lettuce where we needed to harvest it, and then cut just below the ground, cut the stump off and leave the roots intact in the ground. I don't particularly remember what came after this crop, but it would leave a pretty clean bed that we could go ahead and plant back into. Another bed flip I want to talk about is with a cover crop. So this is an easy starting cover crop. If you've never cover crop before, I recommend buckwheat this summer. It's easy to deal with, easy to terminate, fun to grow. So this is a beginning of a stand of buckwheat. It grew for another couple of weeks, and then we mowed it at ground level. This is outdoors in the fall, getting ready for fall brassicas. We solarized it for about a week, and that's what it looked like afterwards. So how do you plant into that, right? What do you do now? That's a big question that we get. So we broad forked. I like that on the right, or on the left, you can see the progression of beans getting worse and worse and worse as the season went on. You can see they're dead there. And then we added a fine layer, a little bit of compost, not a lot, but you know, a little for fertility's sake, and a handful of amendments. Raked it in, and then it was transplanted. So we didn't need to have a fine seed bed. I didn't use the tilther. I raked a little compost over it, and we planted our brassicas right into that. And these are some of the best brassicas. My fall brassicas are some of the best that I had grown. And then I also won't get too far into interplanting or relay cropping, particularly because that's like pretty high level. Like, I'm not even the best at inter and relay cropping. But know that once you start to get a feel for these systems, it's a way that you can really push the maximization of your time and your space by virtually growing, 1.5 crops in every bed instead of 1 crop. All right, here we go. We got another question. Do you have any tips for broad forking because it kills my body? I need more weight and strength. So I have a very peculiar view of broad forking. I know it's difficult. A lot of people broad fork wrong. A lot of people go way too far down with their body. A lot of people use broad forks that are too heavy for their body and their frame. I think finding the right size broad fork for the job and your body is number one. There are some that are made with really light wooden handles. The one that I use is solid steel all the way through. I do that because I also consider it a workout, which I appreciate. Another thing is when you get the broad fork in the ground, you don't have to jump, but what I would do on tough ground is I would stand on the broad fork and just very lightly rock it back and forth. That'll work it into the soil better than you jumping on it. The second is I would take a step back and only pull it down as far as my hands could reach with me standing straight. So I would not bend my back while broad forking at all. I see some people broad forking, they go all of the way to the ground, and that's the wrong way to do it. That's waste. That's a lot of wasted movement. It's a lot of wear and tear on your back. And that defeats the purpose of the broad fork. What you just want to do is create small passageways for roots, air, and water to penetrate below a layer of compaction. And then let the plants and the water and the air do the rest of the work. So, I see videos of people broad fork and I'm like, that's not going to last very long. So another thing is if, some people can't manage that over a long period of time, even that amount of work, maybe have somebody subsoil your field before you get into it so that you don't have to do quite so much broad forking. Or maybe design your beds so that once a season or once every few years, you could run a subsoiler, a shank through your beds. I don't see a problem with that, but that comes into that design your farm to your body and to your level of mechanical involvement. So I hope that answers your question. I said, thanks for your tips. So I want to get into compost use a little bit because not all compost is the same. And I'm going to try and really plow through this next part. So in the Living Soil Handbook, we have types and uses of compost. You don't want to use a really high dollar potting mix compost as a mulching compost because that would be an absolute, absolutely huge capital expense. You don't want to use a mulching compost in your potting mix because your transplants are not going to do well. So match the compost with the use. Again, that's something we detail a lot in the Living Soil Handbook if you want to pick up a copy. And then be careful with contamination. This is what got us off of our last farm. We sold that farm because of a massive load of compost that was contaminated with a persistent herbicide. And it completely, devastated the growing operation. I won't get too much into that, but you can do tests on your compost. Number one, I would recommend have your compost company, wherever you're getting it, do the test. If you're getting it from a company, they should know this information. They should have it. And more people should be requesting that they do these tests because it's more efficient for them to do the test than for 100 different growers to be spending the money to do the test. Two, look up how to do a bioassay. So what you can do is let the compost sit in a 5-gallon bucket of water overnight, and then pour it on a tray or a small growing area of plants, and then wait a few days to see if they show any signs of contamination is another way that you can do it. So just be careful with compost. Amendments, I'm not gonna get too far into amendments. We usually would use a lot of the organic amendments that are out there. Blood, feather, and bone meals, pelletized poultry manure, fish and seaweed, particularly as foliar sprays or through drip irrigation. Getting into what soil test to use, you can use a soil test through the University of Kentucky that's going to tell you primarily the major chemical components of the soil and physical components. Another place that we looked at was Logan Labs. So that's where we got all of our chemical soil analysis through. They'll give you a range of the secondary nutrients and the micronutrients that are available in the soil. And then you can also do biological tests as well to kind of determine where the life in the soil is at. So, these tests include, I can perform these tests. It's something that you could get a microscope and learn to do, with several YouTube videos, learn how to assess that yourself. So are you seeing a wide diversity of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods in the soil? If you are, that's a pretty good sign. Or what do you look for that are typically disease-causing bacteria, or disease causers like ciliates, or bad fungal populations? So that's another assessment that you can use as well. And then moving on to cover. Oh, got another question. Is mushroom compost recommended? Be careful with mushroom compost, particularly in the South. I think it's generally good. One of the sources that we got contaminated compost from was a mushroom compost, because the feedstocks are not required to be organic for large-scale commercial mushroom production. And what was happening is they would get low levels of contaminated feedstocks. After they would grow the mushrooms in them, that material was composted, so those persistent herbicides just became more concentrated. And then by the time it got to us, it was actually quite high in persistent herbicide concentration. So be very, very, very careful. Get a small sample and do a bioassay. And again, if this is coming from a commercial operation, really recommend that they do the test, because they're $400 a pop, and it's a lot easier for them to spend $400 than, again, 100 producers to spend that amount of money. So with cover crops, this is the other big thing I wanted to get to. Here's all the good stuff that they do, right? Build soil organic matter, control erosion, relieve compaction, on and on and on. One of the things that my partner likes to say, and I never really thought about this way until he said it, is if you're not feeding the soil is just going to feed upon itself. Those microorganisms are going to want to consume something. So having a cover crop in place when you're not growing a cash crop, or when you can't grow a cash crop, is a way to keep that soil biology intact through the seasons. Always have a plan for terminating when you plant a cover crop, and know what you're planting after it to make sure it's compatible, or to know what you need to do. One thing that I want to bring up here, I'm going to switch screens, is the Managing Cover Crops Profitably through SARE. It's free online. It's one of my top 5 books for ecological market gardening. This is just one of the tables in the book, but it shows you the impact and the ecology of specific cover crops, as well as any other characteristics they have. And then they also have management challenges. So is it easy to establish? Do you till kill it? Do you mow kill it? I would also add a column, how well does it tarp kill? But maybe we've not gotten there yet. But this book is invaluable if you're going to start messing with cover crops, and it's free. The name of the book is Managing Cover Crops Profitably. Just type that in and type SARE, and it should pull it right up. These are some easy cover crop cocktails to start with. So again, kind of, leveraging diversity. If you're going to grow one cover crop, you might as well grow several. And these are really easy mixes to manage. So if you're wanting a summer, fall soil building cover crop, Sudan grass, sun hemp, cowpeas, and buckwheat, you are going to need a flail mower to deal with that Sudan grass, because it's not something you're just going to push over and throw a tarp on. So maybe if you don't have access to a flail mower, heavy duty mower, take out the Sudan grass and just grow the others. A good winter kill. So you will want something that will winter kill if you're going to go into spring planting. So that's oats, field peas, tillage radish. If you want something to overwinter, to grow when you can't grow anything else, to go into summer production. So if you're going to be planting your tomatoes into this, or your peppers, then you'll want something that will grow throughout the winter, and you'll kill it in the spring. This is what we saw in the previous picture. This is sort of the cover crop that they were growing here to crimp. And that's how you can easily manage it. You can crimp it in the spring, throw a tarp over it for a month, and then when you pull it back, it'll be a mat of straw that you can plant into. And that's rye, crimson clover, and vetch. My favorite resource for getting cover crop seeds and kind of calculating how much I'll need and getting special blends and mixes is greencoverseeds.com. Far and away my favorite cover crop seed source. They also have calculators on there. You can put in, hey, I need cover crops to do X, Y, and Z, and they will give you recommendations, which is good too. So the time versus labor thing. So when you're setting up a system for no-till production or ecological production, it's going to be a high initial labor and cost investment, especially if you're dealing with large amounts of compost or large amounts of mulch, buying silage tarps, buying synthetic mulches like landscape fabric, all of that. The idea is that these costs decrease over time. Something that my partner's really been hard at work on, Jesse Frost, is he has spent the last couple of years not buying any compost. So now that he's got his soil up to a good level of soil organic matter, a good amount of fertility, he's doing more cover cropping. He's using compost that he makes himself, but then he's not supplementing with bought-in compost, partly because of fear of herbicide contamination, partly because we need to start figuring out systems of growing that don't require these huge constant investments in compost. It can be a great way to start a field. It's not a particularly sustainable method for continuing production in the long term. Still, he's seeing really good and positive results, even with the slight increase in cultivation. But one thing that we have to think about over time is what's the return on investment in all of these other areas that we spend money on. So what are we spending on irrigation over the years? What are we spending on inputs over the years? How many passes over a field? How do we calculate the benefit in a reduction of pests and diseases in terms of dollars? So these are some of the things to keep in mind. It can be a little difficult in years 2, 3, and 4, dealing with some of these issues. But then as we see relief from a lot of these things, it's going to be a long-term gain. And again, choose a system that fits your body, your personality, your skills, your resources, scale, tools, goals, all of that. And again, I'm a big proponent of human scale just because, you see this picture here, that's probably the most dangerous job we had on the farm was running the tilther. And there's, my son Arlo was just following, Mark up and down the rows talking his hell. And you can still hear over that machine too. So I think that was a good selling point for me. And if you're already farming, you need a place to start small. Spend a season on this and see what happens over a season instead of diving in all at once. We see a lot of people beginning in high tunnels, typically because they're intensively managed anyways. They're good candidates for implementing some of these approaches. Another way to do it is start with a 50 by 100 plot or a 50 by 50 plot. This is something, you can buy a standardized silage tarp from Farmer's Friend and start there. What I would recommend is if you're able, start with tarping or some sort of stale seed bed approach, grow a cover crop there first and manage that cover crop before starting with cash crops. That's just going to set you up for greater success in the future. And as always, we have very much a no dogma approach. So it's, there are cases where you are going to want to break out a plow or a rotary plow or a subsoiler. What we're trying to do is reduce tillage as much as possible and do all of these other things as much as we can. It's not an all or nothing approach. Throughout this presentation, these are all of the resources that I mentioned. We have our podcast, our YouTube channel, the Living Soil Handbook you can get from our website directly, and it supports all the other work that we do. A few of my other favorite books are The No-Till Organic Vegetable Farm by Daniel Mays, The Lean Farm by Ben Hartman. I think those are two other really good places to begin. And then, we have a community forum that's free and open to the public at no-tillgrowers.community.chat. You can make a free account there, ask tons of questions. Me and Jesse are on there all the time answering questions along with a bunch of other seasoned growers. And it's a really good place to get your questions answered and get some more perspective. Maybe your question's already been answered and you can just search for it. And then the thing that I'll end with is probably my favorite quote when I think about this no-till stuff is, To live, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. And when we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it's a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it's a desecration. So, you know, all of this has been an approach of how can we treat the soil better? How can we build soil? How can we be regenerative while also making it profitable for the farmer? And I do believe that these practices support that triple bottom line. I do believe over time, it makes small farms more profitable. Because it increases the ecological capacity of that farm. And I just think they're more emotionally and physically sustainable as well. So that is a 66 slide presentation that I did in 45 minutes. I'm glad to stick around for as long as it takes to answer any questions, go over anything that I skimmed over, just, you know, whatever we want to do with whatever time we have left here.
Does anybody have any questions for Jackson? You can drop them in the chat or raise your hand, and then we'll call on you to unmute and ask your question. Seems like we've got one. Thoughts on horse manure compost?
We have a lot of horse manure in Kentucky. I do know people that have used it and have done it well. Again, you're going to want to watch for those persistent herbicides in those. I would say if you're using any manure-based compost, start checking for persistent herbicides. Even though, you know, you're not directly importing maybe straw that has been sprayed, it does survive through the animal's digestive system. So that is a big concern. The persistent herbicide issue is a big concern. What we did and what we're doing for the future to mitigate that is not using a manure-based compost, just sticking with plant matter-based compost or a mulch compost like leaf mold. But I think you can largely circumvent a lot of those issues if you cut out the manure. Unfortunately, I mean, that means our manure chain is broken, particularly here in the South. But if you're using manure-based compost, test every batch, at least with a bioassay, to make sure that it's safe. Is any sort of legal requirements? Not that I know of. Not that I know of. I mean, anecdotally, when we took positive contamination soil tests we sent them to a lawyer, and they said, I know you think you have smoking gun evidence, but this is not going to be enough to hold them accountable for what's happened. Part of that is a regulatory thing, part of it's a legal thing. So can I go back? Are there any requirements? I wouldn't count on that. Test your compost, or have them test it. I think it really needs to be brought up to commercial composters, because they're in a bind too. You know, they're getting all of these feedstocks and sources, and it's like, how do you make sure that all of it's clean and still provide a quality product at an efficient price? I think one way is to bring it up to all of the compost producers and say, this is an issue. We just want to make sure you're doing your due diligence to make sure that it's clean. Again, it's a lot easier for them to do one $400 test than for all of us to do $400 tests. So what else do we have? Are wood chips good for mulching? Yes and no. I know of some people that have mulched beds with wood chips. What you don't want is those wood chips being below the soil surface. That's going to tie up nitrogen. I know a lot of people who have sheet mulched with wood chips around things like tomatoes and peppers and left them for an entire season. And then maybe they'll grow a fall cover crop in that space, or turn them in and then grow a fall cover crop. That seems to work okay. You just don't want them down in the soil. A lot of people also use them for pathway management. So just so long as you're not incorporating them and then growing a crop in it without them breaking down first, I don't see any reason not to use wood chips. Shavings or sawdust, I wouldn't, just because they're hydrophobic, and that's going to lead to some irrigation or water issues. What else do we have? Raised beds. Is there a low labor intensive way to make them? You can get a toolbar for a tractor to make raised beds. So if you're going to, say, till an initial plot to get it ready for production, You can get a toolbar with 2 discs mounted behind a tractor, given that the wheel spacing on your tractor is appropriate. Or, you know, if your tractor is at a wheelbase that is the width that you want your bed to be, you can just drive up and down, forwards and backwards down to create sort of a raised bed effect. Are probably the easiest ways that I know of to make a raised bed in this area. Let's see, if the manure is coming from your own farm and using shavings, would you still recommend testing? If your feed is coming from off farm and it's not certified, yes, I would still at least do a bioassay or do something to make sure that the feedstock that you're using is not contaminated. If it's your own feedstock, wouldn't worry about it because you know what's on it. But a lot of where this persistent herbicide is coming from are feedstocks that are ingested. Some of it's coming from mulches like straw and hay, but a lot of it's coming through particularly the manure, so they're ingesting it. Have I had to deal with people believing in the till-only way of farming? If so, how would you educate them or get them to understand your approach? I wouldn't. I would just farm. You know, that's, I think they're, without getting into a big diatribe, organic farming has largely been accomplished, particularly at larger scales, with tillage for the past, well, ever since the back to the landers, right? That's how they controlled for weeds and a lot of the things that conventional agriculture developed things like sprays for. And so I see that, and I think that just on a personal level, there are people that are open to new information and trying things and new ways of doing things. And there are people that are, particularly farmers, conservative to that sort of change and steadfast. That's not bad. It just means they need more than somebody just saying, hey, you can do it this way. They need to see. And I think that's the best way that you can do it, is just, you know, spend a couple of years practicing it on your farm, on your scale. You know, I've had farmers in this area that I knew personally were pretty, you know, oh, what you're doing is, it seems good, but it's not going to work down here. And then after a few years of doing it myself, and they would come to my farm and they would be like, oh, well, this is how you show up with a table of produce at market 52 weeks a year on a small scale. Like, oh, this is kind of making sense to me now. And maybe they would replicate it in a high tunnel or something like that. You know, I feel like some people they're going to need to see it in practice. They're going to need to see it in dollars and cents, or they're going to need to see you at market. And I don't fight with them. I don't try to educate people. You know, I just try and talk to people that are open and receptive to it. And once enough of them start doing it, well, you know, then the people that are more conservative to change will come around. And then once the people that are conservative to change are starting to implement some of these practices, they're probably going to be some of the most steadfast, stalwart folks in promoting it, you know. So I try not to fight people on it. Can I share some ideas for efficient cover crop planting on a small scale? So what I would do is just broadcast it with a bag seeder if I had a plot. So I standardized my field to work in 8-bed wide plots, 8 beds wide by 50 feet long. So I kind of had squares, and I could just make a few passes up and down with a bag seeder, and I would seed at about twice the recommended rate because I was broadcasting and not drilling or seeding with a seeder. And I would just let the cover crop grow up in the pathways as best it could. And then when I managed that, I could press it down if I needed to, or flail mow it and just throw a tarp over the whole area, over the square. We had cut our tarps to match every plot. And that was the easiest way that I found to do it. I know some people direct seed their cover crop, and to me, that sounds incredibly exhausting. You know, I know some people track that they would walk miles back and forth up and down plots, and I just didn't have that time. So I would use a bag seeder. One thing you want to do if you do that is seed to soil contact, especially if you have a fluffy no-till soil. What I would do is use the back of a bed rake or a tine rake and just drag it across the bed tops, not the paths so much. And that would, it would keep it from the birds, and it would improve germination. So that was the easiest way that I found to do my cover crop seeding. Okay, any more
We have,
questions?
yeah, if there's any more questions, drop them in the chat real quick. We've got, I think, 1 minute left. If there aren't any, I guess, if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I will put it in the chat real quick, and I'll try to get in touch with Jackson and see if he can answer your questions.
Sure. Yeah, and by all means, check out our YouTube channel or all of our free podcasts that we host. There's a ton of information in there. I mentioned YouTube. The forum is a great place to ask additional questions. Me and Jesse are on there all the time answering them. That's easier to get a hold of us that way than it is through a direct email anymore. So yeah, thank you all.
Hey, thank you so much, Jackson. And we'll get this video put up on YouTube, and we'll send it to everybody that registered, so you can go back and rewatch. This was a great presentation, lots of great information. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks everybody for attending. Come back on April 4th for our soil health webinar with Dr. Sean Lucas from KSU.